Are you struggling to incorporate self-care into your life? The Rescue Me Retreat is a 3-day retreat for animal caregivers, workers, volunteers, and activists that focuses on managing compassion fatigue and burnout. So many of us struggle with self-care and taking time out for ourselves. But this is really going to be about learning to recharge your battery so that you can go back to work feeling relaxed and reconnected to your passion. Not only will you have the opportunity to slow down and take care of yourself, but you'll also be surrounded by a small group of people that share that same passion for helping animals. You'll be given a safe place to talk about all of those struggles that are inherent in animal welfare work, such as stress, grief, guilt, and trauma that so many of you face on a daily basis. If you are interested in the very first Rescue Me retreat, please head on over to the CompassionFatiguePodcast.com/events where you can learn more. You're listening to the Compassion Fatigue Podcast with your host, Jennifer Blau. This is session 37. Over the last 2 decades, Brent Garrard has walked beside countless individuals and couples facing life changes, difficult decisions, crisis recovery, addiction recovery, and the challenge of overcoming dysfunctional behaviors. He has also worked extensively with those seeking to improve or begin relationships, explore career options, or those simply seeking to gain a deeper understanding of who they are. He believes that we each cope with life's challenges in a unique way, and the process of exploring, discovering, and reconnecting to our true selves is the key to this growth. He assists each individual on their journey towards healing and personal growth to see that while the past brings us to an understanding of who we are, it's important to live mindfully in the present and plan hopefully for the future. Brent is a licensed professional clinical counselor and a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor in the state of Kentucky, where he is a partner in Garrard Howell Therapeutic Partners, LLC. He's also the founder of Relationship Rechargers, an intensive program for relationships in crisis or in need of attention. He is the father of Tyler and Mallory and has been married to his wife and best friend Mariah for the past 20 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brent Garrard. Hey, Brent, welcome to the Compassion Fatigue Podcast. How are you?
Hey, Jen, I'm doing great. It's so good to talk to you.
Absolutely. So Brent and I met, what was it, about a month or so ago? We met at a business conference, and Brent and I got to talking about self-esteem, self-worth, and how oftentimes it's connected to the work we do. So I thought that this would be a great topic for the podcast, and Brent would be a great guest to have on. So this may sound really obvious, but first of all, what exactly is self-esteem and how is it developed?
Well, in psychology, we overcomplicate things. And so you could probably find as many definitions for self-esteem as you had time to look for them. So really, Jen, there are 2 major components of healthy self-esteem. The first one is your personal worth. It's what you think about yourself. And the second one is a sense of your personal competence, what you're capable of doing. It's your ability to cope with challenges that are thrown your way. And it's also how you see yourself as the cause of various effects.
And so is self-esteem, is this something that's always developed in childhood, or is it kind of shaped along the way based on our interactions with others and the outer world?
Well, yes and yes. So the first thing being, as a child, we receive various messages from not only our parents, but the adults in our surroundings, including teachers and extended family members, but also from our peers. And so as we're much younger, boys, for example, may develop self-esteem based on their athletic abilities. Girls, on the other hand, they may value themselves more on appearance and popularity. It's interesting, as we grow and develop as human beings, the way that our self-esteem develops is very consistent with whatever stage of life we're in. So by the time we reach adulthood, we continue to look at external sources as the way that we view ourselves.
And, as therapists, we see a lot of clients that are struggling with low self-esteem, right? And so can you give some examples of maybe what low self-esteem looks like, especially versus a healthy self-esteem?
So I use the analogy of the vacuum cleaner and the Hope Diamond. And poor self-esteem is like the vacuum cleaner. So poor self-esteem relies on external experiences, and it has to do with our doing. So, our culture is oftentimes very bent towards encouraging us to think about ourselves in terms of what we do. Healthy self-esteem comes from our ability to look at ourselves and to really acknowledge both our strengths and our weaknesses. So this is the analogy of the Hope Diamond. Jen, no matter wherever the Hope Diamond is, it's worthy. Its worth doesn't change, whether it is hidden away in the vault of some museum or if it's on the neck of I don't think it would fit on the neck of a beautiful woman, but
maybe a beautiful elephant.
There you go. Or a museum piece. The Hope Diamond is valuable despite what it's doing. And I think it's important for us to, as we seek healthy self-esteem, to see ourselves as being worthy despite our challenges and based on what we have to offer with our strengths.
So it sounds like it's basically an external versus an internal.
Absolutely, yeah. So basically with the vacuum cleaner, I use this analogy with clients because oftentimes they see their worth in regards to their doing. So this has to do with not only your occupation, but also your abilities, even around the house or in your relationships, whether you're a father or mother or in your marriage relationship, especially in our occupations though. This tends to, and you can relate to this as a helper, is that correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. It has to do with what we're doing so many times versus who we are and versus who we are being.
Yeah, so really I think a lot of helpers struggle with, if I'm helping people or animals, I'm doing good work and my self-esteem increases. If I can't help those same people or animals, sometimes, the self-esteem starts to tank a little bit.
Absolutely. It's looked at as failure. And so that's the poor self-esteem, the vacuum cleaner model. It's based on what we do. When you have healthy self-esteem, you begin to understand that especially when you're in a helping profession, that despite the outcome, your worthiness or your ability to help is not contingent upon the outcome.
So again, it's coming from an internal place, not externally based
Absolutely.
on the work that you do or are unable to do.
Absolutely. And so that work is also done in the quietness of our alone time. It's understanding who we are in our being.
Okay. And so when we talk about poor self-esteem, where does that come from and what are some of the ways that you see it manifested?
Well, childhood experiences contribute to both healthy and poor self-esteem. So children who are criticized and who are bullied or teased, abused, and we don't think of this one as being something that develops low self-esteem, but the expectation of being perfect. I think you and I discussed that early. I've struggled with that, the expectation of perfectionism. So that is received from messages all throughout childhood from teachers and families, coaches, and as well as our peers. And, in terms of how it manifests itself, it's very interesting. Oftentimes, we believe that when people are overly confident or even cocky, that they have very high self-esteem. In fact, what we see is that those who act like everything's great or that they don't care what other people think, have very low self-esteem. And so it oftentimes manifests itself as cockiness. And the consequences of this kind of self-esteem, they manifest themselves in drug and alcohol abuse, loneliness, job performance issues, and many other unhealthy ways.
So maybe if for our audience members, if you are struggling with maybe there's a workplace bully or someone, a coworker, a manager that just makes your life miserable, right? It could be that this is almost a front for some poor self-esteem.
Yeah. And so many times when very intimidating figures are a part of our day to day life, we overlook the fact that what they're struggling with is poor self esteem. In fact, when you have good self esteem, Jen, you're able to understand that you are no greater, nor are you any less than anyone else. And in fact, we're all in this together. I know that is one of the things I hear from clients over and over. And I can only imagine with many of your listeners as well, that, there are people that get into the helping professions many times in an effort to heal something within themselves, as we all do. And the message becomes that, we have to act a certain way, or we have to react in a certain way. And, it's oftentimes a mask that we wear. And so it's important to recognize that when someone is being very harsh or hard and coming off as very intimidating, many times there's an internal struggle, turmoil that is manifesting itself as intimidation.
And so essentially making themselves feel better by making others feel worse.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one thing that we don't, as very small children, we just think of anyone that scares us as being bigger than us or more confident than us. And it's actually quite the opposite.
And then, that makes a lot of sense. And so we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I think especially in Western culture, a lot of people base their self-worth on the type of work they do, especially those of us involved in helping professions like, be it therapy or animal welfare. What's wrong with that?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a question that I get often. I think that as a part of your worth, the type of work you do will oftentimes lend itself towards what your gifts are. And so if it's from an internal worthiness that you're doing your work, that's appropriate. It's when our worth gets wrapped up completely in what we do that it becomes problematic. And I know that I have, over the years, as I'm sure you have, worked with people who have been unemployed for disability reasons or just from being laid off from a job, and it hits their worth pretty severely, especially when their worth was wrapped up in what they did. And this is a tendency for all of us. I don't think that that's a weakness of anyone. I think it's pretty common, especially in our culture. But I think it's important for us to pull back and see, is my worth really based on what I do? Is it based on my occupation? Is it based on the skill sets that I use every day, whether it's with animal welfare or whether it's with human welfare? I think it's important for us to look at that and to challenge ourselves to see our worth as being something much deeper than the work we do.
And so just to kind of build on that, why do you think that self-esteem is so contingent on our successes in life? And again, the word success can have many different meanings to different people, right?
Well, yes, success is very subjective. And I think that's the first step. It's to look at, what does success mean to me? Jen, when we think well of ourselves, we just tend to do a better job. Psychologists over the years have realized that self-efficacy is tied to self-esteem in a very interesting way. So what we see is however well you do something, whatever task or job it is you're doing, when you feel that you're good at it, you experience positive feelings about yourself. And so it's important that we see that when we do something well, that we are absolutely going to feel better about who we are. When we feel like we are successful at what we do, and what our purpose in life is, we're going to feel better about what it is that we do. So it's important that we live consistent with who we are. And I think that many times we don't look specifically at what our values are. And so we have to each look at our own values so that we can live consistently with who we are. And then I think striving to be good at what we do. Oftentimes, I know that you had mentioned earlier, workplace bullies and others cause us to really for our work to suffer sometimes, which hurts our self-esteem. Other things, looking at the outcome as being our worth hurts us in the way that we don't feel good at what we do. And then knowing what we want out of it. I mean, having goals and objectives and looking at what those goals and objectives are on a regular basis, and then making sure that we're achieving those goals.
So it sounds like it's really about living in accordance with our own values, not the values that society kind of values. So, for example, maybe if we're talking about Western culture, it will be beauty, wealth, material things.
Absolutely. It's about how much I like me. It's about my worth and understanding what that is for me. So my values being consistent with who I am and what it takes for me to like myself. Oftentimes, as I'm working with clients, they will talk about how their values are consistent with those that they were raised with. And I will ask them, are they consistent with who you want to be?
Mm-hmm.
And many times it's a question that they never think about. It's important that we look at what are my values, what are my specific values, and then why do I value those things over any other thing?
Yeah, it's really hard to like yourself if you're not living authentically, just being who you
Absolutely.
are. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, Brent, is there a difference between self-esteem and self-compassion?
Well, it's another very good question. So it's important that we recognize that self-esteem is not self-compassion. That is something totally different. Self-esteem is something that, as I spoke about earlier, it's not only how I think of me, but it's also how I see my worth and how I'm using myself with external forces. Self-compassion is not about the external. It's about how I talk to myself. It really is about self-talk, and it's about being purposeful about being compassionate towards myself when perhaps my instinct is to speak negatively towards myself.
Why do some people who are so compassionate towards others, whether it's people or animals, why do they so often struggle with self-compassion? Is it a matter of maybe having poor self-esteem and therefore they don't place enough value on themselves to be the recipient of self-compassion, or are there other things there?
It's oftentimes easier for us to be compassionate towards others because that's what's expected of us. In fact, oftentimes in early childhood, we are taught that as we're compassionate towards our parents or towards our siblings, many times if we are put in caretaker roles, even emotional caretaker roles, then we see our worth as being compassionate towards others, if that makes sense.
I think that
So
makes a lot of sense. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's really an attempt to gain self-worth, whether it be with animals or whether it be with, those that we work with. When we're compassionate towards others, there's also an expectation that they're going to be compassionate towards ourselves. That's actually a very healthy relational skill, is to understand that as I'm compassionate towards you, that I would expect you to be compassionate towards me. And so that's what we're doing there a lot of times. Many times, though, the inability or the difficulty in being self-compassionate is being able to walk ourselves through an understanding of our humanity and being able to be vulnerable with ourselves and look inside of our hearts and see that really that we are just as human as the person that we are encountering.
And so, Brent, why is self compassion, or for that matter, self esteem, so important, especially in terms of being able to manage compassion fatigue or even prevent burnout?
Well, preventing burnout and managing compassion fatigue, especially, Jen, I think it's important that we're self compassionate so that we can renew ourselves and rejuvenate ourselves for the caregiving responsibilities that often cause burnout. Caregivers are some of the most hardworking, overcommitted, overextended people in our culture. We're oftentimes burned out from continually overextending ourselves in such a way that we're not using good strategies to relax ourselves and to find support. And in addition to that, really it should be called empathy fatigue, because empathy is really what we're continuously giving out to those that we're working with. It's very difficult in the presence, especially of suffering animals, because of mirroring neurons, and I won't. That's a whole other podcast. But we basically feel the suffering in our own bodies of those that we're working with, and so it begins to wear on us. And if we don't see our own worth and we don't see our own intrinsic value, then it's basically a problem that begins to drive itself. In other words, if our worth is in our work, and we continuously are working and working harder and harder, we're not self-compassionate, and we become fatigued and burned out ourselves. And many times when we do that, especially as helpers, instead of taking ourselves aside and doing those strategies that are basically renewing us, we're just burning ourselves out more and more with our work.
And so it sounds like what you're saying is it's really about placing value on ourselves. And so basically giving ourselves permission to be self-compassionate, to practice self-care, and to do anything else that we need to rejuvenate ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you're a caregiver, especially with animals, you have to give yourself compassion so that you can, be able to cope with the wounded animals that you're working with.
And so, Brent, we both work with clients, I'm sure, that's struggle with low self-esteem, poor self-esteem. What are some of your favorite ways? What are some of your top tips to help people improve or enhance their self-esteem?
Well, I think the number one thing that I work with my clients with is positive self-talk. It is really interesting as I sit and hear what's going on inside the minds of the people that I'm working with day in and day out. I am constantly hearing them talk about themselves in very negative ways, negative thinking. So I think it's very important that we purposefully watch our self-talk. And even with little comments that we make in passing to ourselves, it's very important that we watch our self-talk to improve our self-esteem. Another way is to focus on things that we can change and accept the things that we can't. I know that we are all controlling beings. I always laugh when someone admits to me that they have a control issue, and I immediately welcome them to humanity. So for those things that we can change, it's important that we, point our energy towards those things, and that we understand those things that we have no power of controlling, and seeing what we can do about those, making changes there. Also, doing things we enjoy. It's often difficult for those of us who are working with people and with animals that are wounded or that are in need of healing to have fun. We almost feel guilty with that sometimes. So it's very important, though, for our self-esteem and for our longevity in our careers, that we're able to have fun and celebrate small accomplishments and small things in our lives. And then last, I think going back to the perfectionism, don't strive for perfection. Understand that you're not always going to hit the mark with everything.
So I want to just go back to something you said about making sure you have fun. And, I think one of the best lessons we can all learn from those of us who work with animals is they know how to live in the present and remind us to play.
Absolutely. It's very important that we are mindful of where we are in the present. Many times we get so carried away with either what has happened in the past as we are investigating or finding out more information, or we get carried away with the future and become very anxious with what's going to happen with one case or with another. And we overlook the present. We overlook and are often not mindful about what's going on in the here and now. So it's very important that we're mindful about what's going on in the here and now.
That's great, Brent. So, how can people learn more about you or maybe even get in touch?
Well, they can actually, very soon, I will have a website. It's relationshiprechargers.com, and it should be out within the next couple of weeks. And they can check me out there for more information.
So, Brent, I heard through the grapevine that you are going to be launching your own podcast. Tell us about that.
Well, it is going to be called Relationship Rechargers, and I'm starting that. I'll probably be launching around the middle of October, the end, and it's going to be about relational issues. And we're going to have real live couples in to talk about relationship issues. We're going to have a lot of fun. And so check that out come the end of October 2017.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. So I will put that link up in our show notes page at the Compassion Fatigue podcast in case you want to get in touch with Brent or check out his new podcast. Brent, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It's been great to talk to you again.
Thank you so much, Jen.
All right. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Compassion Fatigue podcast. Please head on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show so you never miss a single episode. And don't forget to check out the CompassionFatiguePodcast.com for more great resources, including a link to join our private Facebook group where you can connect with other listeners and gain support. Please note that this podcast is not meant to provide medical advice or substitute for psychological care. Please consult with a mental health professional if you need additional support. And if you are feeling suicidal, please go to your nearest emergency room or call 911.